and they're going to think that he's making a good argument. Whereas those of us who actually know the material, we read Carrier's book, and page after page after page, you come across arguments like this and you just think, he's wrong. But most people don't have the background to be able to tell that he's wrong. And I think that's actually an interesting point. I often ask people who are mythicists, how much reading have you done on this stuff that isn't written by mythicists? And the answer quite often, usually, is none. They're getting all of their information about this stuff from mythicists, which is a bit like talking to a creationist who thinks they know enough about evolution to be able to refute evolution, and they're getting all their information from creationists.
Do you think that's just an oversight?
A good understanding.
But do you think that's an oversight, or do you think that's a cognitive bias? Because like you said, Richard is not a dumb guy. I think he's very intelligent. Do you think it's just an oversight on his part, or is this just his cognitive bias invested in this? Yeah.
No, I think it's a cognitive bias. I think he has. I mean, I don't want to psychoanalyze someone via the internet, but I think he is very keen on this idea of that Jesus potentially didn't exist. He doesn't say he definitely didn't. He says it's most likely that he didn't, and so he has to therefore find ways to support that. And one of the ways he's supporting that is by saying, well, here's the text that can be read to be talking about Jesus descending just to the lower firmament, not to earth. But I think because of that cognitive bias, he's dismissing the fact that the text clearly says that he came to earth. Nowhere in the text, by the way, does it say where he got crucified. It just says he got crucified and then rose from the dead. But the fact that the text actually has him dwelling among men, come on, that's very, very difficult to just dismiss. And he just kind of brushes it aside. He makes a fairly weak argument that it's some kind of rewriting of a Old Testament reference in Baruch to God manifesting himself on earth. It's a bit confused. But anyone I know who knows this text, who has read Carrier's book, have just said, that's just bullshit. And this is the problem. Most people who read Carrier's book don't know the stuff well enough to be able to see when he's pulling a swift one. And there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in Carrier's book. And he's very good at arguing very forcefully. You have to kind of be able to see what he's doing in order to pick up the fancy footwork. It's usually hidden in some of his footnotes, or you have to actually go and read the text yourself to see where he's misrepresenting. And I think that's one example. There's another one that I want to use. I mean, as we've talked before, it would take me weeks, months, probably years to go through every single mythicist argument and explain why it's wrong. So I can't do that. I'm not going to do that today. But what I want to do is I want to demonstrate. It's way too long. But I want to pick just a couple. And this is another one that I want to talk about that shows that, first of all, mythicists have to go to great lengths to try and interpret the texts so that their ideas still make sense. And people also have to have a very good knowledge of what they're doing in order to see where the smoke and mirrors are actually coming into play. So keep in mind what I was saying before about mythicism argues that there was this early form of Christianity that believed in a completely non-historical Jesus and that believed in a purely celestial Jesus. And because we don't have any texts that actually say that, they have to try and read some of the early material with that as their assumption. And one of the pieces of the early material that they read are the letters of Paul. So they argue that Paul didn't believe in a historical Jesus. They argue that Paul believed in a purely celestial Jesus. Now, the problem with that is that there are several references in Paul's stuff about where he talks about Jesus in such a way that it seems pretty clear to basically everyone, except mythicists, that he's talking about a historical guy. There are about a dozen of those. I want to take just one, and you have to bear with me, guys. I'm going to go through Carrier's argument in some detail. First of all, because I need to show exactly how convoluted it is. Secondly, because I know from dealing with Carrier and his fan base that if you don't go through it in detail, they say that you haven't actually dealt with it at all. So what I'm going to be referring to here is a reference in Paul's letter to the Romans. Now, before anyone's brains explode and says he's talking about the New Testament, yes, I'm talking about a text that found its way into the New Testament. But when Paul dictated this letter to a scribe, because we know that's how he did it, he wasn't thinking that it was going to end up in the Bible. In fact, he probably would have found that fairly weird. This is just a letter. So he was writing a letter probably from somewhere in Greece, probably somewhere in around about the 50s AD, and he was writing to the Jesus sect community. We call them Christians now. They wouldn't have called themselves that at that stage, maybe. But the Jesus sect community in Rome. We know there was quite a large Jewish community, probably in the tens of thousands in Rome, so at least some of them, it appears, were actually followers of Jesus and believed that Jesus was the Messiah. So Paul's writing to them saying, I'm going to come and visit you soon. And so he's addressing this community. And he greets them in the name of Jesus. And he says, he refers to Jesus as God's son, who was descended from David according to the flesh. Now, David, he was King David, the ancient king of the Jews. Paul, clearly, like all Jews in the first century, believed that David was a human being who had existed in historical time. Whether he was or not is another question, but Paul believed that, and this is Paul who's saying this. So Paul is saying that Jesus was descended from King David. You can't be descended from a human historical king if you aren't a human and historical. That just doesn't make sense. So if Paul is saying a descendant of King David according to the flesh, because Paul believed that, like many Jews, believed that the Messiah had a heavenly pre-existence, he's saying in his human aspect, according to the flesh, he was a descendant of this human king. So you have a major problem if you're a mythicist. Romans 1:3 is a bit of a problem. So what does Carrier do with this? Well, what he does is he basically translates this in a different way. So on page 553 of his book on the historicity of Jesus, he translates this as not as who was descended from King David according to the flesh. He translated it as who was made from the sperm of David, manufactured from the sperm of David. So how does he get that translation? Well, the first thing he does is he notes the key verb here, which is genomenu in Greek, which is the aorist masculine genitive of the form ginomai. Ginomai is a fairly broad verb, but it means to come into being, to become, to go from one state to another state, to come to pass. So a lot of those passages in old translations of the Bible, and so it came to pass that this happened, these are usually translations of the verb ginomai. So what Carrier says is, well, that's what ginomai means. It means to come into being, to come about. But he finds one use of a form of the verb ginomai in Paul, where he is talking about in 1 Corinthians 15:45, he's talking about Adam, and he says that Adam became the first man. So Carrier argues, well, Adam wasn't born. Adam was made. Adam was manufactured. God in Genesis, this is what Paul would have believed, God in Genesis is described as forming him out of clay or out of dust and then breathing life into him. So what Carrier argues is if Paul can use a form of the verb, ginomai, to mean to refer to someone who was manufactured, maybe that's what he's doing in Romans 1:3. So maybe ginomai doesn't mean he became, according to the flesh, he came into being as a descendant of King David. What he's saying is that he was manufactured the way that Adam was. Then he looks at the next word, key word in the phrase, which is the noun spermatos, which comes from the word sperma, meaning seed. Now, literally, it means seed, as in the thing you plant in the ground and a plant or tree will grow. But also it is used in semi-figuratively to refer to semen. It can be used to refer to semen. So Carrier says, if ginomai can mean manufactured, and if spermatos can mean not just seed, but semen, maybe Paul is saying that Jesus was manufactured by God out of semen of King David. So how do we get semen from King David in the heavens? Because remember, Jesus, according to Carrier, doesn't come to earth. So how do we get semen from heaven from King David in heaven? Well, then he turns to 2 Samuel 7, 12, 14. Let me read that passage for you. This is a prophet talking to King David. The prophet says, "When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring after you, who will come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. And he will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever." But when he's talking about this in the Greek translation of that Old Testament passage, called the Septuagint, what he actually says is, "I will raise up your seed after you." And then we've got our word sperma again. So Carrier says this: maybe this passage was being read as what we call a pesha, which is a passage that has one meaning in its context that can be taken as having another more mystical meaning out of that context. This is something that Jews did all the time in this period. So maybe when he's talking about taking seed from your belly and raising up a son after you, he's not just talking about King Solomon, which is what it means in context, because he talks about building a temple, the house of God. He's actually saying, it can be interpreted as saying, that he's actually taken physical semen into the heavens and he's going to use that to create the Messiah. So Romans 1:3 is actually saying that Paul believed that there was a cosmic sperm bank in the sky. Let me just read what Carrier actually says. It would not be unimaginable to Paul that God could maintain a cosmic sperm bank. This is on page 576 of Carrier's book. A page later, he goes from "it might be that this is the case" to "it was the case." The notion of a cosmic sperm bank is so easily read out of this scripture, he says, that it's all but required by the outcome of subsequent history, and it's not an improbable assumption. That's on page 77. So we go from text that everyone else translates as he was a descendant of King David, historical king, to Paul saying he was created out of a cosmic sperm bank in the sky by God, and so he never came to earth, and Paul's not talking about an earthly historical Jesus at all, just one created out of someone's semen.
That's pretty strange, actually.
Does that strike you as a very plausible argument, or does that strike you as contrived bullshit?
After what we've seen on this show, yes.
Yeah, exactly. It's totally plausible. No, I don't find that narrative to be convincing at all. Okay. Even plausible.
And that's even before I go through all the problems with it, of which there are many. So let's look in the interest of being fair to Carrier. I mean, there are major problems with what he argues. Let's start, for example, with him saying that the way that Paul uses ginomai in that other passage about Adam means that ginomai can be translated as meaning manufactured rather than just coming into being. If we actually turn to the passage in Genesis where Adam is created and we look at it in the Septuagint, so this is the Greek translations where we see the Greek translation that was around in Paul's time, where we see the way the word is actually used at the time in Greek. What we don't find is a reference to Adam being manufactured, being shaped, using the verb ginomai. We do find the use of the verb ginomai, but we don't find it in relation to him being manufactured. The shaping part is, the word there is eplapsin, which means a form of the verb plasso, which means to form. So when he's talking about Adam being manufactured, when the book of Genesis is doing that, the Greek verb used is not ginomai. It then goes on to say, then he breathed into the face of this figure that he made out of clay, and he became a living man. So the becoming part, ginomai, is not the shaping. It's the bit that happens after he breathes life into him. He goes from one state of being to another, which is what ginomai means. So ginomai does not mean manufactured. It means coming into being, which is the standard way in which that verb is translated when people are translating Romans 1:3. The problem with his translation of somatos as many